What if some of the most important information about your longevity is missing from your annual physical? Most of us, we know our weight, right? We may know our blood pressure, and our cholesterol and maybe even our blood sugar, right? And more people these days are tracking steps and sleep scores and HRV, which is heart rate variability. And all of those numbers can be super useful, but they don't fully answer a more important question. How much physical and physiological reserve, remember that word, are you carrying into the next decade of your life? How effectively can your body use oxygen, right? How much metabolically active muscle do you have? Are your bones strong enough to withstand a fall? Are you carrying harmful visceral body fat? Are you sleeping well enough to repair the body and the brain that you're working so hard to protect? Today we're going beyond lifespan, and we're talking about the measurements that help us to understand health span. And as we've talked about health span, lifespan, just a lot, and so I'll define that really quick for you. Lifespan is the amount of time that you live, right? And then health span is the amount of time that you live well, and that's how I like to define that. And so we're going to explore why sleep might be one of the most important things and most underestimated things that you can do is to prioritize your sleep. It's one of the most important longevity interventions, really, that are available to us that most of us are not prioritizing, you know. And so we'll also examine some fascinating new research that's asking whether sleep and exercise can influence the behavior of mutated blood forming cells. This is pretty interesting study that I want to talk about. And we'll look at evidence that lifelong training may be leaving older muscle biologically younger, right? And then we'll break down two assessments that can help turn the idea of longevity into something measurable and actionable. And those are the VO₂ max test and DEXA testing. All right. And this isn't really about chasing perfect scores. All right. Don't get fixated on chasing scores. That'll just stress you out. Trust me. I've been there, and I wear a wearable, and most of you guys know this. I wear an Oura ring, and every day the first thing I do is I check my sleep score. I check my resilience score. Check my HRV, see what my HRV got up to at night. All those things I check, and I don't want to say I'm neurotic when it comes to those things, but I do like to know where I'm at because I work hard, and I know that you work hard too. And so I just want to just bring it back around. We don't want to, have this information, these scores, so we can become fixated on them, and stress us out. But it is good to have these things, right? It's about having and understanding a starting point, about identifying your biggest opportunities, and building enough reserve to remain capable for as long as possible. So, welcome to the Longevity Game Podcast. I'm Michael Ward, and this episode is all about longevity metrics that matter. VO₂ max, sleep, muscle, and bone. Thanks for joining. Before we begin, a quick reminder, this podcast is for education and general information, right? It's not personal medical advice. Your health history, your medications, your symptoms, and individual risks, they all matter, right? So speak with a qualified healthcare professional before making any changes, to your exercise, your sleep, nutrition, and even your medical plan. All right. This is just us talking. You might want to take this information to your medical provider and be like, okay, I want some more information on this, but don't make any changes until you get that cleared. All right. Longevity is often presented as a search for the next breakthrough molecule, right? The next breakthrough supplement or peptide, or biological age tests, right? And those areas can be extremely interesting, but they can also distract us, from something just way more fundamental, right? Living longer and living better requires reserve, right? Reserve. You need cardiovascular reserve just to climb stairs or recover from illness, to tolerate surgery, and remain active. You need muscle reserve, to lift and carry and stabilize your joints, and maintain glucose control and prevent frailty. You need skeletal reserve so that, a minor fall doesn't become a life-changing fracture, right? And you also need neurological and metabolic recovery, in reserve. And that's where sleep enters the picture. The central idea for today is really, really simple, right? Sleep restores the system. And again, most people, they undervalue sleep and so they don't prioritize it. And I say that a lot, right? But sleep restores the system. Exercise challenges the system, and VO2 max measures your aerobic engine. And then DEXA helps us to kind of examine the chassis, right? The bones and the muscle and the fat, right? And so none of these measurements individually tell the entire story. And so together, however, they give us a much more meaningful view that just stepping on a scale can tell us, right? And so let's begin with the behavior that supports nearly every system that we're trying to improve or optimize, right? And that is the sleeps, the sleep stuff, the sleep piece, right? And so, we sometimes talk about sleep as if it's like time that's taken away from us, We sleep, we should be sleeping 1/3 of our life, And but I've heard people say, "Well, I'll sleep enough when I'm dead," or maybe I'll sleep when the work's done, And and full disclosure, I used to say both of those things, But the more I started tracking these things and then relating those things, those metrics to how I feel, and then trying to dial in those metrics, I started feeling way better. I mean, this is I no longer say those things. I do prioritize sleep. I try to get 8 to 9 hours a night, and if I can get 9, that's awesome. But I typically get between 7 and 8. Okay, but I am trying, and I feel better, when I do that. And so, sleep's not a period where the body just simply shuts down. It's really, really important. It's an active and highly coordinated, state that involves the brain, the cardiovascular system, the immune system, the endocrine system, and even your metabolism. It's super important. As a matter of fact, during sleep, the brain processes and consolidates memories, right? Also, neural networks that are involved in learning are reorganized when you sleep. Hormonal rhythms are coordinated. Blood pressure normally falls, which I've been tracking on my Oura ring. My blood pressure is falling at night predictably and as it should, and that's important. It also, your immune activity changes when you get adequate sleep. The body repairs tissues and prepares for the next period of physical and cognitive demand when you sleep. Our body does its best work when we get enough sleep, and so it's super important. It affects how we perform, the behaviors, that preserve longevity and support longevity. When we're sleep deprived, I mean, chaos ensues for sure. Exercise feels harder, reaction time and judgment deteriorate, right? Hunger and appetite regulation changes, and we may reach for more calorie dense foods. We might move less during the day, and we'll have far less patience, for our routines and even the people around us. You know, I'm sure you've noticed that when you get low sleep, you're a little edgy. You might be a little bit more edgy, right? So, sleep doesn't just sit beside exercise and nutrition as some kind of unrelated third pillar, right? It really influences our ability to execute, you know, all of them. It's just super important. So if it sounds like I'm trying to sell you on sleep, I am. I'm trying to. You know, Usually people will say, well, how much sleep do I need? You know, well, the most, I guess, responsible answer, you know, is that most adults should try to be getting at least 7 hours. Like I said, I try to get between 7 and 9, really 8 and 9, but I like to stay up late, and I don't really like to get up early. And so the summer's been, the kids have been off for school. And so I've been sleeping much later. My clinic doesn't open until 10, and I structure that way on purpose. And so I have been sleeping a little later in the day, which allows me to stay up a little later at night, which I enjoy. But the kids are going to start school soon, and then I'm going to have to switch my schedule a little bit, but I'm trying to maintain that 8 to 9 hours. But again, duration is just one dimension of sleep health, right? There's at least 3 useful questions. First, quantity. right? Are you giving yourself enough opportunity to sleep, right? And then the next is quality, right? Are you sleeping soundly, or are you repeatedly waking up throughout the night? Do you have like disturbed sleep patterns, Are you tossing and turning, that kind of thing? And then the last one is regularity. And a lot of people don't consider this important, but the time that you sleep, your sleep and your awake times, they matter, right? And if they're reasonably consistent, that is also important. You have to maintain consistency because it helps to establish your biorhythms, And so when you consistently go to bed at night and wake up in the same times, roughly, that's really important, you know. In a large observational analysis using more than 10 million hours of activity from about 60,000 UK biobank participants, sleep regularity predicted mortality risk more strongly than sleep duration does. How about that? That third piece, the regularity, sleep regularity and consistency was super important. And so I don't know if you understand that. So mortality risk means the increased risk of you dying early, right? And so sleep regularity predicted a higher rate of mortality more than just sleep duration alone. Okay. So I hope that landed. Anyway, that doesn't prove that irregular sleep causes early death. All right. Observational studies, which is what this was, can be affected by health status, work schedules, socioeconomic conditions, and a lot of other factors. Right. But the finding, it really reinforces what circadian biology has suggested for years, right? The body benefits from predictable timing. Even like, I remember this from I have 5 kids, 5 boys. And when you're young, kids love, they might not say they love, but they need that predictability. They need that consistency. And we also need that consistency as we age. But life shows up and things get busy, and so consistency kind of falls to the wayside, unfortunately. But this is very, very important. Predictable, consistent sleep schedules. Consistent sleep schedule helps to synchronize light exposure, right? It helps to regulate melatonin, your cortisol. These are the biorhythms I'm talking about: body temperature, appetite, and even metabolic activity. So in practical terms, a regular wake time may be, one of the most useful anchors for the entire sleep wake cycle, right? So the time you get up in the morning. I have something called a Verilux, and I'm looking at it right now behind my computer, and it's a 10,000 lumen light that I turn on in the morning on the days that I get up very early. And it just, it's like, it's, it's very bright. It's very bright. And it reminds me, there was a movie with Jim Carrey. Gosh, what is it called? You guys tell me, what's it called? Where he meets God, right? Well, there's one scene where he's going to the building where he's supposed to meet up with somebody who he doesn't know is God. And anyway, this door opens up and this light just, and he's like, oh my God, it's, so bright. That's what it feels like. But what it does, it does something called circadian priming, and it primes your circadian rhythms by just zapping your melatonin first thing in the morning as soon as you wake up, and it establishes your routine throughout the day, your sleep wake cycle. And so if you want to try that circadian priming, or just take a look into that circadian priming, it's really, really helpful. And you sit in front of that light for about 10 minutes and you are awake, right? So grab your coffee, sit down in front of the light, and let it just kind of wake you up. Obviously, if you get up, in the morning and the sun's up, it's even better if you can go outside and let the sun just kind of shine on your face. Take your socks and shoes off if you have those on, and then just kind of walk out on the ground. Do some grounding work. You know, and so anyway, yeah, that's what I do, and these things matter, right? And so for performance, though, sleep is where training is converted into adaptation. Does that make sense? Exercise is a stimulus, right? And so, it temporarily disrupts the system when you exercise. Recovery is the period where the body rebuilds and adapts, right? And if we repeatedly add stress every day, without sufficient recovery, sleep, then more training doesn't necessarily produce more progress, right? If you're not getting that sleep piece, then your recovery and your progress is going to stall, right? So it's important. You got to do it. Inadequate sleep can affect reaction time. Have you heard that, you know, sleep deprivation is very similar to, like, if you're driving, it's very similar to drunk drivers. Your reaction time is slower. You're just all over the place, and it increases the risk, obviously, the more sleep deprived you are, and but it also can affect decision making. It can affect perceived exertion, right? Because if you're exhausted, you may go to the gym and work out. And last week, I know I could lift this weight easier, but this week I'm just feeling just run down. Could be the sleep, right? Also, glucose handling is affected. Appetite and immune functions all handled. It's all regulated by the quality of sleep that you get, right? And so it may also interfere with the consistency required for your training regimen, right? And so you got to get to sleep, guys. And this is also why, sacrificing sleep to add another early workout can become self-defeating, right? And I've done that. I've slept 3 or 4 hours and I'm like, I got to get my workout in, and I'm just dragging. And I said this too. Any day at the gym is better than no day at the gym. Any terrible workout is better than not going and working out. And so, I mean, there's two sides of that. But if you're not sleeping well enough consistently, you're not going to see the gains that you want to see. Right. Okay. Let's see. We should also avoid reducing every sleep problem to poor discipline or inadequate sleep hygiene. Okay. And so the reason I say this is because, persistent insomnia is really a legitimate clinical condition. Like, some people just have a very, very hard time sleeping. And cognitive behavioral therapy, for insomnia is a very well supported treatment. And it's different from simply being told to put away your phone, and turn on some soft music and read a boring book and all that stuff. And also, obstructive sleep apnea. This is another critical longevity issue. If you have loud snoring, or if you've been told that you snore very loud, or somebody's witnessed you, stop breathing in the middle of the night, or gasping during sleep, or maybe you have morning headaches a lot, or maybe you have difficult to control blood pressure, you know, uh, if you have all that and then maybe some unexplained daytime sleepiness, that stuff shouldn't be ignored. This is something you need to take a deep dive in. You might want to see a a pulmonologist, sleep study expert that can do a sleep study on you to make sure that you don't have obstructive sleep apnea. Sleep apnea repeatedly, it disrupts breathing and oxygenation and is associated with, like, cardiovascular and even metabolic consequences, high blood pressure, right-sided heart failure, that kind of thing. I actually had a friend who I lived next to, and one morning I was coming home. I was working an overnight ER shift, and I was coming home, and as I'm driving by his house, he's being wheeled out on a stretcher by the EMS, and he's got a sheet all the way over his body. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what has happened? And then his wife sees me pull up, and she runs to me, and she's like, he's dead. He's dead. He wouldn't wear his CPAP, and he died in his sleep because he refused to wear a CPAP. How terrible. Sleep apnea is serious business. So if you feel like you may have something that, something like that, or any of those things that I mentioned, you may want to go get that checked out. Right? Super important. Right? There's no supplement, there's no wearable or perfect bedtime routine can substitute for identifying and treating, an underlying sleep disorder. You got to get that stuff checked out. All right. Speaking of wearable devices, they can help us to observe patterns in sleep duration, timing, our resting heart rate, even our respiratory rate, right? And really our overnight behavior. Like, if we're tossing and turning, it'll tell you that kind of thing. They're super helpful for trends, right? But a consumer device like an Oura Ring, it's not a clinical sleep study. Okay. It's an estimate of deep sleep and REM sleep, and light sleep. And it's based on an algorithm. And it's usually using movement, and cardiovascular signals to come up with that data, right? It doesn't directly measure sleep, in the same way a polysomnography does with brain waves and eye movements and muscle breathing and oxygen, all that data, it's not the same thing. And so don't think because your wearable is telling you things look great that things could be great. Like I said, if you've been told those things, you snore, you have breathing pauses, headaches, blood pressure, problems, don't sleep on that. Don't sleep. No pun intended. So you can use a wearable device, to kind of trend, maybe like a compass, right? But this is not a like a courtroom verdict, right? This isn't something that's solid. You got to dive in. All right. So I beat that dead horse long enough. But anyway, all of this data kind of just helps make sleep relevant to longevity, right? It's super important. New research asks an even more surprising question. And this is this study that I wanted to talk to you guys about. Can sleep and exercise influence the behavior of cells that have acquired age-related mutations? Yeah. Yeah, that's wild, right? So let's talk about these mutations first, right? So as we age, our cells accumulate mutations over time, right? And to some of you guys, that may sound alarming, but I mean, if you think about it, our cells divide all the time, and so they're gonna eventually there's gonna be some mutations that occur, right? It's a normal part of biology, right? In most mutations, they don't create an immediate health crisis, right? But sometimes, however, a mutation gives a blood forming stem cell a competitive advantage, right? And so the cell produces descendants carrying that same mutation. And then the population of those cells begin to expand, right? And this process is known as clonal hematopoiesis, right? Clonal hematopoiesis. And clonal hematopoiesis becomes, unfortunately, more common with age, and it doesn't mean that a person has leukemia. All right. This isn't the same thing, but certain forms are associated with higher risk of blood cancers, inflammation, and even cardiovascular disease. Right. So this recent study published in Nature examined how physical activity and sleep related clonal hematopoiesis and how physical activity and sleep relate to clonal hematopoiesis. Right. And so the investigators, they analyzed really large human data sets, right, including more than 90,000 participants, and also performed mechanistic experiments in mice to for this, for the same thing. The most interesting finding was not that exercise and sleep were universally beneficial in every mutated cell, right? That wasn't the case. It was that the response appeared to depend on a specific mutation. Okay, so in models involving the JAK2 and the V617F mutation, sleep and exercise influence communication between bone marrow immune cells and blood forming progenitor cells, right? And so the intervention reduced inflammatory interleukin 1 beta signaling and shifted the mutant cells toward a less proliferative metabolic state. Okay. And it reduced clone expansion and atherosclerosis in animal models, right? And so other mutations didn't respond the exact same way, right? And so that's an important point, okay? The body doesn't have one generic aging pathway, right? We talked about that. The different mutations, tissues, inflammatory signals, and really environmental exposures can cause may respond differently, right? To the same lifestyle behavior. Does that make sense? And so, what does this study mean and what does it not mean? This is important, right? So, this study does not show that sleep or exercise removes a mutation, right? But it does not, well, and it doesn't prove also that someone can treat diagnosed clonal hematopoiesis merely by sleeping longer or joining a gym, right? Okay. It does not prove that, right? It also doesn't mean that everyone needs expensive genetic screening for blood cell mutations. All right. What it does suggest is a little bit more nuanced, and in some ways a little bit more interesting, right? So the environment surrounding a mutated cell may influence whether the cell expands. It may influence how it uses energy and how much inflammation that it promotes, right? And so genes may load the gun, right? But biology is not always a simple trigger pull, right? So behavior, immune signaling and the cellular environment can affect how risk is expressed among every single person, right? And so this is an emerging area. We need more controlled human interventions, trials before we really, we turn this into a clinical recommendation for clonal hematopoiesis. But it does add a new mechanistic layer, right, of advice that, already, has pretty strong support for cardiovascular and overall health, right? And so, it also gives us a bridge to the next question, right? If lifestyle can affect cellular behavior, what does decades of training do to the biology of muscle itself? hmm Let's shift gears. So, does lifelong training leave muscle biologically younger? This is an important question, right? Because we're all trying to push back, on aging, on father time. You know what I mean? And so, muscle is much more than tissue that helps people look athletic and aesthetic, right? And I've said that again. You look damn good when you got a lot of muscle, right? But that's not the purpose of muscle, right? It's a cherry on top. It's our movement system. It's a major site of glucose disposal. You've heard me say it in the past, our muscles are glucose sink, right? It holds a lot of glucose. The more muscle you have, the better your body is able to manage glucose, storage. It's also a reservoir for amino acids and one of the foundations of resilience during illness and aging, right? The more muscle you have, it's awesome, right? With age, many people experience loss in muscle mass, they experience loss in power, and strength and mitochondrial function, and also just the ability to recover after injury. But chronological age does not affect everyone's muscle the same, right? And we talked about that too. A recent multi-omics analysis examined human skeletal muscle across age and training status. Multi-omics just simply means, researchers looked at several layers of biology, right? Such as gene expression, proteins, metabolites, and lipids, and, you know, other than relying on just one simple, marker, right? But physically trained older adults demonstrated roughly half as many age-related molecular differences as less trained older adults, right? That's awesome, right? Their muscles preserved better pathways involved in cellular respiration and energy metabolism. And they also mounted a stronger molecular response to an acute exercise session, right? So just, the more muscle you have, the older you get, the better your body works, right? In plain language, trained older muscle did not merely look different. It retained a more youthful biological profile in several important systems, and it remained better able to respond when it was challenged, right? And so that last point's a banger, really. Healthy aging is not a complete absence of change, right? It's the preservation of adaptability. Let me just sip on some water. My throat is dry. All right. Let's see. Can the cardiovascular system increase output when needed? That's an important question. Can muscle respond to training? Can glucose be cleared effectively? Can the immune system respond to threat, and then stand down when it needs to? You know, can the body recover after illness, or injury or travel or disrupted sleep? Reserve and adaptability are very closely related, right? The more reserve that we maintain, the less likely an ordinary challenge is to push us beyond our functional threshold, you know? And so, the study also identified that molecular changes that appeared less responsive to training, right? So exercise trained muscle was not identical to young muscle, right? We have to get that off the table. And exercise didn't erase every sign of age, okay? But that's not an L, right? We're not taking an L on that one, right? It's simply a reminder that exercise is not magic, it's medicine, okay? Like any medicine, it affects depends on dose, type, timing, the adherence, consistency, and even the person that's working, you know? So a longevity program should excuse me, should preserve several distinct qualities, right? It should preserve aerobic capacity, muscular strength, uh, muscular power, balance and coordination, mobility, and adequate muscle mass, right? Those things are it should contain all those things, a complete longevity program. And so walking is valuable, but walking isn't going to preserve all those qualities. You see what I'm saying? So resistance training, it matters, and faster or more demanding efforts also matter when appropriate. Power, which is the ability to produce force really quickly, it often declines earlier and faster than maximum strength and is highly relevant, for people, for to be able to catch yourself if you're starting to fall, or you trip, having that power to, prevent something bad from happening is super important, right? Well, so here's a great question. How do we quantify the aerobic side of that reserve, right? And this is where those two metrics I was talking about, we're going to talk about one. This is where VO2 max enters the chat. All right. The aerobic engine, VO2 max. This is to me is probably one of the most important longevity metrics there are. VO2 max, it refers to the maximum amount of oxygen the body can take in. It also measures the maximum amount of oxygen the body can transport and use during intense exercise, right? It reflects the combined performance of several systems. The lungs, they must bring oxygen into the body, right? The heart must pump oxygenated blood throughout the body. The blood and the circulation must transport it, right? And the muscles must extract that oxygen and use it to produce energy. And that is why VO2 max is such an integrative measure, right? It's not simply a lung score, right? Or a running score, right? It affects the capacity of the entire oxygen delivery and energy production system. And so you may be asking right now, so why does VO2 max matter for longevity? I'm glad that you asked. You see, cardiorespiratory fitness is consistently associated with cardiovascular outcomes and all-cause mortality, which means death from any disease or non-disease, right? And so low fitness is a meaningful risk marker, while higher fitness is associated with lower risk across a wide range of adults, okay? And this has led a lot of people, including me, like I said, to consider VO2 max probably one of the most important modifiable longevity metrics that you can track, all right? And modifiable is important. The word modifiable, that's an important distinction because VO2 max is influenced by your age, by your sex, by your body size, your genetics, your health status, medications, and even how you train, right? And so it can oftentimes be improved. I mean, unless you're like an elite athlete and you're tracking this stuff all the time, you may be at your peak. I don't know. But most people can improve upon their VO2 max, right? Someone doesn't need to be an elite athlete, right, to benefit from an optimal VO2 max. Moving from a very low fitness category into a higher one may be more important than just chasing marginal gains, kind of at the top, right? And so think VO2 max as maybe like your aerobic engine, okay? And so if you think about it, daily life well, let's say it like this. Daily life, it generally uses only a portion of that engine, right? And if your maximum capacity is high, climbing stairs, carrying groceries, playing with your grandkids, or walking through an airport, right, uses a smaller percentage of your available reserve, right? But as capacity declines with age or inactivity, or just not really taking good care of yourself. That same task, it consumes larger percentage of your reserve, right? And eventually, ordinary activities begin to feel like maximal efforts. You know what I mean? And so that's the one reason VO2 max is not an athletic metric. It's really an independence metric. And I think it's really important to know, and it's important to take that data and do something with it and improve it, right? And so you may be asking, like, so how do we test VO2 max, right? Well, during a direct VO2 max test, a person will exercise on, a treadmill or like maybe a bicycle, or some other appropriate device. Maybe, what do you call these things? The, and I'm drawing a blank. elliptical, anything that will allow you to increase your effort, right? And so while you're doing those things, one of those things, you're also wearing a mask or a mouthpiece, that's connected to a metabolic analyzer. And so the workload gradually increases while the system measures inhaled and exhaled gases, right? And so depending on the testing environment and the protocol that you're going through, the assessment may provide peak or maximal oxygen consumption, um, carbon dioxide production, ventilation, your respiratory exchange ratio, your heart rate response if you're wearing like a heart monitor, ventilatory thresholds, exercise intensity zones like zone 1, 2, 3, 4, and then recovery behavior, right? And so these data help answer more than what's my score, right? They can actually help identify how the body responds as effort increases and provide more individualized targets for your training. And that's really cool, right? A lot of watches like my even or wearables like my Oura Ring, it estimates VO2 max. You can do like a 5-minute walk test and it'll tell you what your estimated VO2 max test is, right? But it uses your heart rate, it uses your pace, the power, your age, and other inputs, right? And those estimates can be really great if you're observing trends, right? Particularly when your training and testing conditions are consistently the same, right? But they remain estimates. You know what I'm saying? Like heat, my gosh, hills, fatigue, medications, inaccurate heart rate readings, and just the devices that you use, whatever it is, it's proprietary algorithm. It can also, all those things can affect the result, right? So a VO2 max test will be kind of the creme de la creme, if you really want to assess what your aerobic engine is doing, right? You got to remember, like I said, direct testing measures respiratory gases, right? It doesn't, and that does not make every direct test perfect. However, calibration, protocol selection, effort, technician of, skill, all that matters. But it does provide a different level of information from just a wearable estimate, you know? And so, we should also resist replacing one oversimplified score with another, right? A high VO2 max does not guarantee healthy blood pressure, you know? It does not guarantee healthy coronary arteries. It doesn't guarantee adequate muscle or strong bones or even restorative sleep, right? Some highly trained people still have medical risk factors. Conversely, a lower VO2 max can be affected by medical conditions or even medications. And so you got to interpret those appropriately, right? I think the best use of a VO2 max is part of a dashboard, right? You want to establish a baseline. You want to interpret this, the test in context. And then you want to design an appropriate training regimen based on that VO2 max. And then over some time, you want to retest under very comparable conditions, hopefully the same place that you went at the first time and you have the same tester, so that you have that consistency, right? And then you want to look for meaningful change over time, right? And that's how you take the VO2 max test and you do something with it, right? Again, it's just not a score you just want to check off. I've got this score. You want to use it and improve it, right? Different people, they require different programs, right? But improvement typically involves a foundation of lower to moderate intensity aerobic work mixed in a little bit when appropriate, carefully dosed higher intensity intervals. I've been doing this sprint interval training, which is a type of HIIT, high intensity interval training. And sprint interval training is absolutely incredible. I have really enjoyed it. I've tried to do it twice a week, and I will get on a treadmill and I will run for 40 seconds as fast as I possibly can. And I just hold it for 40 seconds. And then I walk for between 20 and 30 seconds. And then I do that 5 times. And then after 5 times, I walk for about 3 or 4 minutes at 3.5, and then after that, I do it all again, and you do that again 5 different cycles, and then you do again walk for 2 or 3 minutes, and then you do it a third time. So 3 sets. It usually takes me about 30 minutes, to do all that. But man, when I'm done, I am blitzed. I am exhausted. I am sweating like crazy, but man, I feel great. It is really great. But again, you don't want to start doing that until you get cleared to do that. Not everybody can do sprint interval training. It's something you definitely need to warm up to. But man, if you can get there, it is really something. The fat will it's really awesome. The easier work builds volume. It also builds efficiency and durability, right? Higher intensity work like sprint interval sprint interval training. It challenges those upper limits of your oxygen delivery and the way your body uses oxygen. And so the correct balance depends on your training status, your health, your orthopedic limitations. Like you might not be able to sprint, maybe you can sprint on a bike, and even your recovery and your goals, right? Your goals may not be the same as mine, right? And so more intensity is not automatically better. The best program is demanding enough to create adaptation and safe enough to recover from, and realistic enough to repeat over and over again. And this really brings us back to sleep. A training program only works when the body can absorb it, right? And so you got to get to sleep, remember. VO2 max tells us a lot about the engine, but it doesn't tell us about the rest of the body, right? What it's made of, and for that, we turn to DEXA. So DEXA is DEXA, or you might see DEXA as DXA. DEXA stands for dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, right? And so this technology uses very low dose X-rays and at 2 different energy levels to distinguish between bone, mineral, and tissue and fat tissue, right? And so many people know DEXA as a bone density test. And, that's what most people go get a DEXA just to check what their bone mineral density is. But there are, some really great types of DEXA scan machines out there that will also analyze body compositions, And so, both of these are correct. You can do bone mineral density or body composition scanning, but they're not going to be the same exam or the same report. So you actually have to do one or the other. Or you can do both, but it's going to be, you got to request that, right? The protocol, the scan region, the device, the software, and the clinical purpose matter as to which one that you're going to do or which one you need, right? So let's start with bone. Bone is living tissue. It continually remodels in response to hormones and mechanical loading, nutrition. Even your medications can affect bone mineral density. Also your health conditions and of course your age, right? And so when bone mineral density declines, fracture risk can increase, right? Osteoporosis is often silent, right? So a person can feel completely normal, right? And until a relatively minor fall or even even a movement can produce a fracture, right? And it's then that you're like, dang, I got to get my bone mineral density checked, because, I've seen people just step off a curb and they break a hip, just stepping off a curb, and this is generally elderly populations that I see this in the ICU. And so hip and vertebral fractures can trigger a cascade, right? Pain, hospitalization, immobility, loss of muscle. Then that leads to reduced confidence, social isolation, and then really eventually a loss of independence, And unfortunately, many, many people die once they have a hip fracture. So anyway, that makes skeletal muscle, if you think about it, it's central to longevity, right? It's not a secondary concern. It's super important. All right. A clinical bone density exam commonly evaluates areas such as the hip and the lumbar spine, right? And the report can also include something called a T-score and a Z-score. And so a T-score compares bone density with that of a healthy young adult reference population and is commonly used in diagnosing low bone mass and osteoporosis in appropriate populations, right? And then a Z-score compares the results with people of a similar age, sex, and other reference characteristics, right? and they can also be used, useful in other clinical contexts. Okay. But those scores should be interpreted by a qualified healthcare professional. Diagnosis and treatment decisions may also depend on fracture history, maybe the age of the person, the family history, medications, smoking, alcohol use, fall risk, all that stuff, right? And so, it's going to be different for everybody. You got to take all this stuff into account whenever you're coming up with something. And so that's why it's really important to take this data to a healthcare professional that knows what they're looking at and they can really put you on the path, right? People naturally want to repeat a bone density scan to see how their bones are looking or if they're seeing improvement, right? And trending can be extremely valuable, but bone changes slowly. All right. This isn't something you want to repeat every month. You know what I mean? If you're looking for bone mineral density scans, you know, there can always be a little bit of a margin of error in these scans. And so whenever you get them so close together, it can be a little bit incorrect, right? Here's a comparison. You want to use the same facility and preferably the same machine when possible. All right. You also want to maintain consistent positioning and scan protocols every time you go back, right? You also want to pay attention to the facility's least significant change. The amount of difference required before a change is likely to exceed measurement variability. All right. You need to take note of that. And then choose the retesting interval based on clinical circumstances, not just because you're impatient and you want to know what your bone mineral density is doing this month compared to last month. Okay. A tiny numerical change does not necessarily mean that you're seeing real bone gain or real bone loss, right? Especially when it's that close together. I would say maybe every 6 months to every 12 months for bone mineral density. Bone responds to mechanical stress, right? And so resistance training and appropriate weight bearing or impact activities like plyometrics can play important roles. And this is all depending on the individual's health and their fracture risk. All right. You want to make sure adequate protein, adequate calcium, vitamin D status, energy availability, and hormonal health are all considered here. They all matter, right? Certain medications and medical conditions can also accelerate bone loss, as I mentioned before. And so anyone, with say osteoporosis or maybe previously maybe have fractures from the past or significant risk factors, they need individualized medical guidance rather than just generic exercise prescriptions, right? I mean, it's super important not to put somebody on a path that you just put everybody else on. And then, something bad happens. That's no good. That's no good. Okay, so we talked about bone mineral density testing using DEXA. And let's talk about body composition testing. Now, a conventional scale, when we step on it, it tells us our total mass, right? It can't tell us what that mass consists of or where that mass is located, right? And then BMI, it adjusts weight for height, and it can be useful at the population level, but it doesn't directly distinguish muscle from fat. When I take, my BMI says that I'm obese, but I carry a lot of muscle mass and it doesn't figure that in. So BMI is a great metric, like I said, at the population level, but individually, it doesn't mean much if you carry a lot of muscle, right? It doesn't reveal whether fat is concentrated around the abdomen either, right? It doesn't tell you if you have fat around your liver, right? There's a lot of things that are going on behind the scenes, and the scale is just not going to tell you, right? Two people can have the same weight, they can have the same height, they can have the same BMI, and while having very, very different muscle mass, fat distribution, metabolic risk, and even physical capacity, right? And so a DEXA body composition scan helps us look beneath the total number, right? Depending on the scanner, and there's a lot of different kinds. I have bought a DEXA scanner. It's a Hologic, and it does bone mineral density and body composition scanning. And it's really incredible piece of equipment. It tells you total fat mass. It tells you body fat percentage. It tells you your total lean mass. It tells you regional lean and fat mass. Like, regional meaning, left side versus right side, It tells you android and gynoid fat distribution, appendicular lean mass in the arms and the legs, right? An estimate of visceral adipose tissue, and all these things can each measurement individually can help answer a different question. And so it's really, really cool. Again, stepping on a scale will not tell you any of this stuff, right? Total body fat percentage provides context, but it should not become an identity or a moral score, right? Regional measurements can help. It can help us understand, distribution of fat, right? Appendicular lean mass can contribute to the assessment of low muscle mass. And then visceral fat estimates may add information about, stored fat around the abdominal organs. That type of fat is actually metabolically different from the subcutaneous fat underneath our skin. And it's really important to know what that visceral body fat looks like. It's the most inflammatory and the most difficult to lose, and it drives insulin resistance. So seeing that and seeing improvements in that is really, really important, especially if you have a lot of comorbidities, right? And so we have to be really precise with the language here. I want to make sure that DEXA measures lean soft tissue. It doesn't directly isolate pure skeletal muscle in every single region of the body, right? Lean mass includes water and other non-fat, non-bone tissues, okay? There's things like hydration, glycogen, recent exercise, food intake, and even testing conditions can affect your composition results. And so that's why it's really consistent. Preparation matters, consistency matters when you're tracking the changes. Also, DEXA, it doesn't tell us how strong or powerful the muscle is. Two people with similar lean mass may have different strength, right? They may have different neuromuscular function, and they also may have different physical performance. All right. So for a complete picture, here, body composition should be paired with functional measures such as grip strength. I love doing grip. We test grip strength on most new patients. Major movement patterns like gait speed, chair rise performance, like sit to stands. How many times can you sit from a chair to standing in 30 seconds? Doing balance testing, or other appropriate strength and power testing. All those things together make a really good picture on how you are functionally. And then we can improve upon those things, right? And people here, this is particularly important. People who are on GLP-1 medications, man, this kind of testing is really, really important. When someone loses a substantial amount of body weight, whether through lifestyle changes, medication, surgery, or just a combination of those things, right? The scale can't reveal how much came from fat versus lean tissue, right? And so some loss of lean tissue can occur with weight reduction. And I see that myself. Every time I do a bodybuilding composition, I have to make sure that I'm not losing a whole bunch of muscle along the way, but I always expect to lose a little bit, right? It's always going to happen. The goal is not necessarily to prevent every ounce of lean tissue change, right? But to preserve as much functionally important muscle and bone as reasonably possible, right? Does that make sense? And so this means monitoring the quality of weight loss is much more important than the quantity of the weight loss, right? Resistance training, appropriate protein intake, sufficient recovery, and individualized medical or nutritional guidance becomes especially important at this piece, right? A DEXA baseline and a thoughtfully timed follow-up can help really determine whether the plan is moving, the body composition the way that we want it to do, and so doing the baseline and then getting a body composition test every 3 months would be highly valuable if you're really trying to dial it in. Some people get them every month. It's such a low dose rate. It's less radiation than a chest X-ray, right? And if you compare that, a chest X-ray, when you're flying at 30,000 feet, you are being exposed to solar radiation, about the equivalent of a chest X-ray. And so if you fly a lot, you may be getting a little bit more radiation than you think, right? But DEXA scan uses very low ionized, ionized, ionized radiation. Anyway, regional DEXA results may show differences between the left and the right sides, right? And so those differences can be useful clues, particularly when you're interpreting those alongside like injury history, or performance testing, right? And so the scan, however, does not diagnose the cause of those things. So positioning, previous surgeries, limb dominance, pain, and measurement variability can influence those results, right? But an apparent asymmetry should generate a question, if it's really, really off, but it's not an automatic diagnosis. Okay. Like I said, DEXA involves very low dose radiation, but and again, it's ionizing radiation, right? Pregnancy status and other clinical considerations should be addressed according to the facility's policies where you get your scan done and medical guidance. And so results also can vary across manufacturers. This is why it's important to use the same one every time, because you can see pretty big differences depending on the scanner. Just the scanner, the software versions, the positioning, the protocols, they can all look a little different. And so, that's why a single scan should not be treated as perfect truth, right? And this is also why repeat testing and consistency is really important, right? So the real power of DEXA scans, is not to receive an elaborate report. It is using that reliable, that data to make better decisions, right? And so, we've covered a lot of ground here. So let's bring it together. Sleep tells us about recovery opportunity, timing, and in some cases, the possibility of an underlying disorder, right? And so VO2 max tells us about integrated cardiorespiratory fitness and your aerobic reserve, right? And DEXA helps us to assess bone mineral density and look more deeply at lean mass, fat distribution, and just body composition trends over time, right? Strength, power, and balance and mobility tells us whether the tissue that we do have can perform useful work, right? And so blood pressure, metabolic health, symptoms, medical history, and conventional laboratory testing, they remain essential, right? Those are really, really important. None of today's measurements replaces primary or specialty medical care. All right. The goal is not to collect the largest possible number of data points, right? The goal is to collect information that changes your decision, right? And how you move forward in your fitness and your health, right? So I guess a good thing to do would be to ask yourself before taking any kind of measurement, what are we trying to answer, right? Is this the right test for the question, right? Is this test going to give us the answer we're looking for? And then if we do the test, how will that result change the plan that I'm currently on? And then lastly, when would repeating this test be meaningful, right? Those questions are super important. And that sequence protects us from turning longevity into really an expensive data collection without an action scenario, right? So the framework we like is straightforward. Measure, interpret, intervene, retest, right? So first, establish a reliable baseline. Second, interpret it in the context of age, your health history, your medications, your symptoms, your goals, and just other measurements, right? And then third, build an individualized plan of attack, right? And that might include aerobic-based training, carefully prescribed interval training, like I said, resistance exercise training, balance work, my gosh, a sleep evaluation maybe if you need that, nutrition changes, or just a referral to a specialist for, specialized medical, right? And then finally, repeat the measurement only after enough time has passed for meaningful change to have occurred, right? And under conditions that make the comparison valid for you. Okay. And remember, the score is not the destination, right? The score helps us to choose the path that we want to take. Okay. And so, here's a preview of kind of what we're building at Next Level TR2. This is an area that we're going to be discussing a lot, right? Much more in the coming weeks because we are working toward bringing in VO2 max testing. And we have a DEXA scan that's being built right now and for our own program and for our own patients. And so, our goal is not to hand someone an isolated number, like I said, and label it a longevity score, right? And then send them on their way, right? We want to help people establish meaningful baselines, understand what those measurements mean and do not mean. And then we want to translate those results into actionable plans and then track whether those plans are producing real change. For VO2 max testing, that looks like, beyond the baseline, we wanted to see if their exercise performance is improving, right? And this is going to inform smarter training as well. For DEXA, it means looking into the body, right? Looking at body fat percentage to understand bone mineral density, lean mass, fat distribution, visceral fat, and changes in that stuff over time, right? And in both cases, it means placing the result, in a larger health span picture that helps, includes sleep, strength, mobility, medical risk, and even that person's actual goals. And so we're going to share some more details as we get closer to launch, including what that testing experience involves, who may benefit from that testing, how to prepare, what reports that we're going to show, and how results can be used responsibly going forward. We're excited about the technology, but we're even more excited about helping people to convert information into action, right? And so if there's only one takeaway from today, it's that longevity is not merely the absence of disease, right? It is the presence of reserve, right? It is having, aerobic capacity that daily life does not approach your maximum, right? Enough muscle and power to remain useful, steady, and independent. Enough skeletal strength to tolerate the inevitable challenges of aging, and enough restorative sleep to support the brain, the immune system, the metabolism, and the adaptations that you're working to build so hard. The emerging research, on sleep and exercise and mutated blood cell clones and trained muscle, it gives us an increasingly detailed view of, how our behavior may reach all the way down into our cellular biology. And that's wild. But we shouldn't lose sight of that larger message. You don't need to wait for that perfect anti-aging drug to begin improving your health span. Protect your sleep. Build your aerobic engine, train your strength and power, understand your body composition, take bone mineral density seriously. You want to measure what matters and use those measurements to guide action rather than generate anxiety. You know what I mean? Because the objective is not to win a number. The objective is to remain capable enough to keep playing the longevity game. Yes. Thank you, everybody. If you found this episode useful, please follow the show and share it with someone who wants to build a longer, stronger, and more capable life. You send us your questions about sleep, VO2 max, DEXA scans, muscle, bone health, or body composition. We may answer them in an upcoming podcast as we get closer to introducing our new testing program. Until next time, guys, build your reserve and go long.